We'll continue on with the brain, looking at the structures therein. We have the diencephalon. And so the diencephalon is made up of the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the epithalamus. So we have three different structures that are contained within here. The diencephalon is going to enclose the third ventricle. So we're going to have the third ventricular space here covered on either side by the diencephalon itself. And so the thalamus is the largest of the three structures that we have here on either side of the brain. They're kind of an egg-shaped type of a mass, a large amount of cell bodies. This is going to be essentially kind of the way station for information coming in and going from the brain. And so especially the information coming up as sensory information is going to make its way into it. We can divide it up into several different groups of nuclei. And so we have the anterior, we have the dorsal, we have the ventral, and then we have the posterior groups that make up the individual components of the thalamus. Each individual group of nuclei is bringing in different types of information, and the thalamus kind of works in a sense like a traffic cop. It's kind of determining where things are going to go, and so it's kind of sorting out the information, possibly editing some of the information, deciding whether it needs to eventually go up towards the cerebral cortex or not. And so all of our incoming ascending sensory information makes a stop here in the thalamus before it heads up to the cortex itself. And so it's going to play a role in all of our information as far as sensation goes. And so determining when that information needs to make its way all the way up to the cortex or not. In terms of learning where that information needs to go, past experiences as far as memory goes, of all of that sensory information as well. The hypothalamus is a unique structure within the brain in that it is kind of the command center for just about everything going on metabolically within the body itself. And so it's just a little bit anterior and inferior to the thalamus. It kind of points outward as kind of almost a cone, so to speak, or a double cone as it moves anteriorly. It has two little bumps on it called the mammillary bodies. These mammillary bodies are where we're going to have information coming in from olfactory. So the sense of smell is going to stop in this area here, especially for that information related to reflexes for that information. Our mammillary bodies are relatively small compared to other animals, since we don't rely upon our sense of smell as a primary sense for detecting things in our environment. The hypothalamus has a connection down to the pituitary gland, and that occurs through the infundibulum. And so that's going to connect the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. Part of the pituitary gland actually arose from the hypothalamus, and so it grew as a downgrowth towards the hypothalamus. And then the other part of the pituitary gland grew up from the oral cavity. And so we have the anterior and posterior pituitary within there growing down from the posterior and up from the anterior pituitary from the oral cavity. When we look at the hypothalamus itself, it's very busy in terms of the number of nuclei that are there. There's a lot of information being processed here within the hypothalamus. And so everything from sleep-wake cycles as far as getting information from vision, from auditory, from taste, from smell, hunger, satiety, all of these things are all controlled by the hypothalamus. And so we have things related to hunger and satiety that is there, sleep-wake cycles for the body, things like pleasure and also rage. And these ones go along with the hunger and satiety aspect as well. And so think about it when somebody's hungry, they may start to get on the angry side. And after they have eaten, they're going to be relatively satiated, and so they're going to be calm and collected and things like that. The easiest way to see this kind of a process go on is just to simply observe a baby. And so a baby, when they're extremely hungry, they get all cranky. There's nothing that can, in a sense, satisfy them until they actually eat, and then they're completely calm, they're relaxed, and so on, because that has then satiated them and they're no longer hungry. The hypothalamus plays a role in everything from blood pressure to cardiovascular output to breathing, as far as the rate and depth of breathing itself goes, as well as the rate and depth of heart contractility that is there. And part of how the way that the hypothalamus does this is through an endocrine function. And so it does have a little bit of a hormone function as well as the nervous system side of it. One of the other big claims to fame of the hypothalamus is its ability to maintain normal body temperature. And so it's dealing with our thermostat essentially for the body and determining when we need to turn things up and when we need to turn things down. And so that hypothalamic endocrine axis that we have here goes kind of two ways. One is that the hypothalamus is going to produce two hormones that are going to be kind of end product hormones, and those are going to be antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And so these two hormones are going to get secreted down to the posterior pituitary, and they're going to stay there until the hypothalamus says that we need them. The other hormones that it produces are releasing hormones that go down to the anterior pituitary to tell the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. So it's really kind of controlling essentially all of the endocrine functions that we have, just in a little bit of a roundabout way. The epithalamus is the most posterior portion of the diencephalon, and so this is at the far back of the diencephalon. This is going to form part of the roof of the third ventricle. Extending out from the epithalamus, we have the pineal gland. And so the pineal gland, or the pineal body, is going to produce one important hormone called melatonin. And so this melatonin is, you may have heard of needing melatonin to go to sleep, things like that, or taking melatonin supplements for just that reason as well. And that's where melatonin comes to play. And so melatonin levels typically cycle throughout the day. And so they're going to go up and down as the day goes on. And typically in the PM, those levels are starting to rise. And so as it starts to get dark outside, our levels of melatonin starts to rise, and that essentially tells us that it's time to go to sleep. And so if we're not producing enough of that melatonin, we may not be able to fall asleep the way that we normally should. Part of at the roof of the epithalamus, we have the choroid plexus. This choroid plexus is the area, one of the areas where we're going to produce cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, for the ventricles themselves. So here we have the epithalamus sitting at the very back of the diencephalon there. It's a relatively small structure. There's not a whole lot to it there. And then tiny little pineal gland or pineal body kind of extending from the back end. For the brainstem, when we look at the brainstem itself, so now coming down from the diencephalon, we move down into the brainstem itself. We have, again, three regions. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And so these three structures make up the last portion of the brain before we enter into the spinal cord themselves. These brainstem components are essentially going to be a lot of pathways passing simply through them. And so we've got a lot of information that's going up the cord as far as sensory information goes, and coming down the cord to the cord as the motor information. And so the pathways themselves are going to be simply traversing through the brainstem here. Some of them are going to be making synapses as well, especially when we're talking about the sensory side of things. And so many of the ascending pathways are going to stop here in the brainstem on their way up. The brainstem is associated with 10 of the 12 cranial nerves. And so the first two cranial nerves, the optic and the olfactory nerves, are not directly associated with the brainstem. They go back directly into the cerebrum. And so our olfactory and optic nerves are the two outliers for the cranial nerves. And so all the rest of the cranial nerves are going to originate from the brainstem itself. And with the exception of the trochlear nerve here, all of the cranial nerves are going to originate from the anterior or lateral sides of the brainstem. And so the trochlear nerve is the one that's going to arise from the posterior side. So we're looking at the posterior side of the brainstem here, and that's going to allow us to see where that trochlear nerve actually emerges from the midbrain there. All the rest are coming from the anterior side or the lateral sides. The midbrain is our first connection from the cerebrum back down into the brainstem, and so just below that thalamus there. It's going to have connections back to the cerebellum, and so we're going to have cerebellar connections as well as cerebral connections. And so on the posterior side there, we have our cerebral peduncles, and so this contains our descending pyramidal tracts coming down through to the midbrain itself. Running through the center of the midbrain, we have the cerebral aqueduct, and so we can see that cerebral aqueduct connecting the third and fourth ventricles as it runs through the midbrain as well. So although the trochlear nerve is exiting from the posterior side, the oculomotor nerve, the first of our cranial nerves to actually have its origins in the brainstem, is here as well. And so oculomotor and then trochlear nerve. We're going to have a couple of other nuclei that we can find inside the brainstem here as well. And so we're going to have the colliculi. And so we have a superior and an inferior colliculi. These are dealing with information for vision and auditory. And so the superior colliculus deals with visual reflexes, and then the inferior deals with auditory reflexes. And so this is going to allow for that information to quickly come into the brainstem and potentially quickly go back out to control either the eyes or the head and neck that is there. We have two big nuclei as well that are essentially stained, so to speak. And so we have the substantia nigra and the red nucleus. And so these two areas here have a component of pigment that is found within the cells themselves. And so the substantia nigra has melanin in it, and it's going to make it a darker color. And then we have the red nucleus, which has hemoglobin in it, and that's going to make it stain that red color that is there as well. So red nucleus here and substantia nigra here on either side there. Here we can see our cerebral aqueduct running through the center of the midbrain itself. And so that's going to allow us to see the connection between the third and fourth ventricles. Any place where we have cranial nerves coming in, we're also going to have at some point a nucleus for that cranial nerve. And so here we have the oculomotor nuclei that we can see there. If the cut was done in just the right spot, we would then also be able to see where that nerve is actually projecting out towards the outside as well. So where it's going to emerge from the brainstem. Moving down to the pons. The pons itself is pushed anteriorly by the cerebellum, and so it's bulging forward in a sense once it's there. It sits in between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. It makes up the anterior wall of the fourth ventricle, the cerebellum making up the posterior wall there. And so we have those connections in between for the ventricles as well. Within the pons itself, we're going to have a couple of cranial nerves that are originating from the pons. Cranial nerve number 5, and then 6, 7, and 8 are kind of at the junction between the pons and the medulla. So they're right at the edge of the two for those. So they're not completely in one or the other per se. The pons is going to essentially be one of those areas where we're connecting the spinal cord up to higher brain centers. And so this is where we're going to have a lot of relay in terms of fibers synapsing here in the pons before they head on up. And at the same time, we have information coming down from the cortex and the cerebellum making their way to coordinate with movement between the cortex and the cerebellum themselves. So here we can now see where we have cranial nerve exiting the brainstem itself. We have the nuclei of our trigeminal nerve here. And so trigeminal nerve sending its fibers out. Kind of looks like an actual nerve running through the brainstem that is there. We can see how the pons bulges anteriorly and comes out to the front there. The cerebellum is basically going to be connected back in here. And so we'll see that connected on the posterior side of that fourth ventricle. The last stop within the brainstem before we get to the spinal cord is the medulla oblongata. And so the medulla oblongata is the last region before we get to the cord itself and before we actually exit the skull. So this is going to be just before the foramen magnum. The anterior portion of the medulla has two big kind of ridges in it, and these are going to be the pyramids. And within those pyramids, we're going to have the decussations. And so this is where our descending motor information from the cortical spinal tract is going to run through them and make their crossover at that point. And so we see the pyramids themselves, and we have our information for motor descending down through there, eventually going to end up into those anterior horns of the spinal cord as it makes its way. We have a little bit more choroid plexus here. So the fourth ventricle is continuing on down just a little bit. We're going to pick up the rest of our cranial nerves here as well. And so we'll finish out from 9 through 12 along the medulla oblongata as well. The ninth cranial nerve sits kind of at the junction again between the pons and the medulla itself. And so it's in between the two there. But we do have the cranial nerves and the nuclei for cranial nerves 10, 11, and 12. The 12th cranial nerve is unique in that it pulls up portions from the spinal cord as well. So we're going to have some fibers that actually come up through the foramen magnum and join in with that accessory nerve there. A couple of components to the information that is coming in from our vestibulocochlear nerve. We have the vestibular nuclear complex here. This is going to work essentially between the ear and proprioceptive information and visual information to help to maintain balance. So to keep our equilibrium about us once it's there. We talked a little bit about the components of the cuneatus and gracilis before. And so we saw the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus in the spinal cord, and where they synapse is here in the nuclei of the same name. And so for the upper extremity, the cuneatus, and for the lower extremity, the gracilis. The medulla has a lot to do with our overall kind of keeping us alive portion of the brain. And so it has cardiovascular and respiratory control in these areas. The pons is also going to play a big role in terms of respiration as well, in terms of the limiting of inspiration. But in terms of the depth and the rate, this is all controlled by medulla for both cardiovascular and the respiratory systems. Behind the brainstem, we have the cerebellum. And so the cerebellum itself is kind of stuck onto the pons and the medulla posteriorly on there. It's a relatively large structure, and so it does make up a little over 10% of the brain's mass. And so we have quite a bit there. The cerebellum is going to deal with proprioceptive information. And so one of its big components is its influence over muscle contraction in terms of skeletal muscle contraction that is there. This is all unconscious. And so this is all unconscious proprioceptive information. We also have our conscious proprioceptive information about where things are as well. We have an awareness of where all of our joints and muscles and skin and everything are at any given time. But the cerebellum also does the same thing. And once again, we have a caricature within the white matter for the distribution of our information into the cerebellum itself. And so the cerebellum working within the idea of balance and kind of keeping everything in line as far as motor control goes, works along the ability to essentially make corrections to the plan of movement. And so we're going to do that within the cerebellum. The cerebellum, similar to that of the cerebrum, it does have some lobes. And so we have an anterior, posterior, and a flocculonodular lobe within it. It does have gray matter and white matter, so we could see that on the last drawing there as well. And the white matter portion makes kind of like a bush or a tree appearance to it, and we call it the arbor vitae. The cerebellum connects back to the brainstem via 3 cerebellar peduncles. And so this is going to connect the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles via the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So processing, it's dealing with information that is coming up proprioceptively from all of the joints, essentially telling the cerebellum exactly where we are at any moment. And the cerebellum is then going to take that information and essentially kind of compare it to what it is we want to do. And kind of the easiest way to think about this is going up or down a flight of stairs. Sometimes when you get to that top or bottom of the stairs, you're not necessarily paying attention. Maybe you're carrying something and you get to the top or bottom of the stairs and you either think that there is another step or you think that there isn't another step and there really is. And either way, you start to trip and fall. The cerebellum's job is to make sure that we don't fall. And so it's going to influence the movement that we're about to do. And so it basically has a blueprint of the movement that we want to do, and it compares it with, in a sense, where the body is at that moment. And if it senses that we need to make a change because the terrain changed, there isn't an extra step there, but we tried to step up again and we start to miss it, that needs to be very quickly altered within the plan. Otherwise, we're going to fall on our face. Since the cerebellum's job is basically figuring out the plan all the time, one of the other functions that it does is cognitive function. And so once again, kind of problem solving types of things. And this again goes along with things like language. Language is a problem solving process. And so where do the words go? Where do we put the words? Which words do we want to say next? All of those kinds of processes come in when it comes to cognitive function. And these are the kinds of things back when you were in like the elementary school, they did the kinds of puzzles or things where what comes next. And so they give you a sequence of things and they try to get you to find out or figure out what is supposed to come next in that sequence. In order to understand whether the brain is functioning properly or not, we need to look at the brain waves themselves. And so we do this using an EEG, and so an electroencephalogram. And this is going to, as we look at the waves as they're being generated, we're going to see oftentimes one of 4 different types of patterns. And so we're going to see alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, or delta waves. And so alpha waves are kind of like when you're watching a show, or you're just kind of relaxing, you're not really doing a whole lot. These are alpha waves. Your brain isn't having to think much about anything. Beta waves are more about that kind of concentration. You're alert, you're concentrating on things. This is doing things like studying. This is doing things like taking a test. This is potentially doing things like driving, hopefully. You're using beta waves in order to keep yourself mentally alert to the surroundings that you're in. Theta waves aren't as common in adults. These are going to give us, in the conscious person, they're going to be more common for like a dreamlike type of a state, kind of like daydreaming, things like that. They can be found during sleep. Delta waves are definitely found during sleep, especially when we get down into deep sleep, and we'll talk about sleep in just a moment. The other time where we see delta waves is when somebody is under anesthesia, and so this is a way to monitor and make sure that the anesthesia is working properly. If the person, in a sense, is supposed to be awake and we're seeing delta waves, this is a good indicator that there is brain damage. The person's in a coma, something like that. So here we have an EEG in progress, and so we can see kind of the pattern of the alpha waves, the beta waves, the theta waves, and the delta waves. giving that distinctive pattern as they go along. If those electrical patterns are disrupted in any way, one of the things that we may see is something like a seizure. And so this is where we have an abnormal electrical discharge coming from a group or a large area of the brain itself. And so we generally have kind of two big kinds of seizures. We can have petit mals and grand mals. Petit mal seizures are sometimes referred to as absence seizures. This is kind of like in a child, they're playing, they're doing their thing, and then all of a sudden they just, like somebody hit the pause button. They just kind of stop and they have a blank facial expression. You can't arouse them, you can't get them to respond to you or anything like that. They're just kind of paused. Usually lasts under 30 seconds or so, and then they come back. They're unaware of any kind of lapse of time. They're unaware of any kind of thing that has occurred. They just go right back to what they were doing. Versus a grand mal type of a seizure, this is going to get loss of consciousness. This is going to have them disoriented in terms of where they are. They may not necessarily know where they are. Things like that. They may not know what day it is, what month it is, who's the president, all those kinds of things after a grand mal type of a seizure, which is going to involve a larger area of the brain. Many other types of seizures can occur, especially in kids at times. You see things like febrile seizures. And so when they're sick and they have a fever, that high temperature fever can lead to a seizure as well. We can get seizures from head injuries, from lack of oxygen. If somebody passes out, they may have a seizure while they are passed out, especially after they start to rebreathe and start to get some oxygen flowing back to the brain itself. And that is oftentimes something that is seen after somebody has a syncopal episode. So what does it mean to be conscious? And so when we look at the brain and the brain activity, when it comes to consciousness, we're going to be looking for kind of the brain having simultaneous activity over a large part of the cortex. And so the anterior portion, the posterior portion, the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, and so on are all kind of working and firing at the same time. With that, we're able to do different activities. And so we're able to process information in different ways while we are conscious. That leads to kind of this holistic, kind of totally interconnected processing by the brain itself. If that stops, we may have a episode of fainting, and so just a lack of blood flow to the brain itself. And so this may be where a person stands up too quickly and they start to decrease the amount of blood pressure going to their brain. And if they don't sit back down or lay back down quickly enough, they may faint. This can extend to something where the brain has sustained some sort of injury and they lapse into a coma. The brain is essentially shut down into a deep, deep sleep, so to speak, and we're unable to rouse that person. We can confirm that coma by a change in the amount of oxygen that is being consumed by the brain at that time. From there, we have sleep in general. And so sleep itself runs in two major stages. We have REM sleep and we have non-REM sleep within the sleep cycle itself. And so non-REM sleep begins with kind of relaxation. You're laying in bed, you're getting ready to fall asleep. Your body is kind of just tuning out, so to speak, and we're going to see a predominance of alpha waves. Once we fall asleep, then the EEG may bounce around in terms of not having a regular type of a signal coming out. Arousal can be difficult, and so this is a period of time where you're not really able to be woken very easily at that time. From there, we may start to dream and start to see delta waves and theta waves within the processes themselves. And then stage 4, this is where we're in kind of the deepest amount of sleep, and so we're down into the delta waves once again. Although a person can be in delta waves, this is typically where we see sleepwalking occurring as well. Roughly every 90 minutes through sleep, a person is going to cycle through REM sleep. And so they're going to start to cycle through and get into this period of time where essentially their whole body shuts off. And so especially when it comes to the skeletal muscles. And so the skeletal muscles become inhibited, with the exception of the extraocular eye muscles, which is why we get rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, that is there. REM sleep is restorative sleep. This is what we need to wake up refreshed. We need to get down into that REM sleep and cycle through it multiple times throughout the night in order to wake up ready and ready to go for the day, in a sense. If our sleep is being disturbed by things like insomnia, sleep apnea, then we're going to have an issue with potentially getting down into that REM sleep, and we're never going to feel refreshed, so to speak. And so insomnia may come in the form of not being able to get to sleep, or it may be in the form that you fall asleep for a little while, but then you wake back up, and then you can't get back to sleep again. All kinds of different issues can lead to insomnia itself. Oftentimes they are some sort of metabolic issue that is going on within the body. Sleep apnea comes from a blockage in the airway. This may be due to anything from being sick and having upper respiratory tract infection, and it blocks the airway some, and so you're having to breathe through your mouth more. Oftentimes this is going to be associated with as well snoring, and weight of the individual is going to play a role there, especially when they have an excess amount of adipose buildup in their throat. So in their neck and in around there, that can start to oppose their breathing as well. And so they may literally stop breathing for 20, 40 seconds throughout the night. And sometimes this is again and again and again and again. And essentially the only way for them to start breathing again is they have to arouse themselves. And so they kind of wiggle a little bit and they start to wake up some and then start to breathe normally again. Last thing for the cerebrum is the formation of memories. And so we have essentially two sets of memories. We have long-term and short-term memory. Short-term memory is the idea of where did you park your car when you came to a class or when you went to the grocery store, something like that. How do you find the car again? Short-term memory can be just a few minutes, and it can be even hours. And so going into a grocery store and being there, or going shopping or someplace, that leads things to be oftentimes in short-term memory. In order to get things from short-term to long-term, one of the things this is kind of comes from in terms of studying and things like that as well, is we have to do things like rehearsal. We have to associate it with some other type of information. So put it together with some sort of other memory that you already have, possibly associate it with another type of information, a past memory, other things like that, until that information becomes automatic and unconscious. In a sense, you kind of know it frontwards and backwards as far as that information goes. And that's really the goal of learning to do things in terms of a new skill, or learning things as far as for memorization. Another way to attach things is through emotion. And so if there's an emotional component to how you learn something or how you experience something, it can get transferred over into long-term memory as well. And so hopefully as you study through A&P, you're able to transfer everything over to that long-term memory as you go.